Welcome, dreamer. Before we begin tonight's gentle journey into rest, I want to take just a moment to thank you for being here. If you enjoy these calming sleep stories and they help bring peace to your nights, please consider supporting the channel by liking this video, subscribing, or sharing it with someone you care about. Your support helps keep this cozy space glowing for all who need it. Now, let's settle in. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. Let the day begin to melt away. You're safe here. You're held. And you don't have to do anything except relax. Tonight, we'll drift into a world where starlight dances across a quiet lake, where the air is cool and clean, and the only sound is the soft ripple of water beneath your boat. With every breath, we'll go deeper into stillness, gently floating, gently dreaming. Let's begin tonight's bedtime stories. Clown, madman thou errest, I say there is no darkness but ignorance, in which thou art more puzzled than the Egyptians in their fog. What is the opinion of Pythagoras concerning wild fowl? Malvolio, that the soul of our grandam might haply inhabit a bird. Clown, what thinkest thou of his opinion? Malvolio, I think nobly of the soul, and in no way approve his opinion. 12th Night, Iver. 2. I remember, said Mrs. Overthaway. I remember my first visit. That is, I remember the occasion when I and my sister Fatima did, for the first time in our lives, go out visiting without our mother or any grown-up person to take care of us. Do you remember your mother? Asked Ida. Quite well, my dear, I am thankful to say. The best and kindest of mothers. Was your father alive too? Ida asked with a sigh. The old lady paused, pitying the anxious little face opposite, but Ida went on eagerly. Please tell me what he was like. He was a good deal older than my mother, who had married very early. He was a very learned man. His tastes and accomplishments were many and various, and he was very young-hearted and enthusiastic in the pursuit of them all his life. He was apt to take up one subject of interest after another, and to be for the time completely absorbed in it. And I must tell you that whatever the subject might be, so long as his head was full of it, the house seemed full of it too. It influenced the conversation at meals, the habits of the household, the names of the pet animals, and even of the children. I was called Mary, in a fever of chivalrous enthusiasm for the fair and luckless Queen of Scotland, and Fatima received her name when the study of Arabic had brought about an Eastern mania. My father had wished to call her Shahrazad, after the renowned Sultana of the Arabian Nights, but when he called upon the curate to arrange for the baptism, that worthy man flatly rebelled. A long discussion ended in my father's making a list of Eastern names, from which the curate selected that of Fatima as being least repugnant to the sobriety of the parish registers. So Fatima she was called, and as she grew up pale and moon-faced and dark-eyed, the name became her very well. "Was it this Fatima who went out visiting with you?" asked Ida. "Yes, my dear. And now as to the visit. The invitation came on my 13th birthday. One's birthday is generally a day of some importance, a very notable day whilst one is young, but less so when one is old, when one is being carried quickly through the last stages of life, and when it seems hardly worthwhile to count time so near the end of the journey. Even in youth, however, some birthdays are more important than others. I remember looking forward to my 10th birthday as to a high point of dignity and advancement, and the just pride of the occasion on which I first wrote my age with more figures than one. With similar feelings, I longed to be 13. The being able to write my age with 2 figures had not, after all, shed any special luster upon life. But when I was in my teens, it must feel different somehow. So I thought. Moreover, this birthday was really to bring with it solid advantages. I was now to be allowed to read certain books of a more grown-up character than I had read hitherto, and to sit up till 9 o'clock. I was to wear sandals to my shoes. My hair was henceforth to grow as long as I and the fates would permit, and the skirts of my frocks were to take an inch in the same direction. "In 4 more years," I said to Fatima as we sat on the eve of my birthday, discussing its manifold advantages, "in 4 more years I shall be grown up." Miss Anstead was introduced at 17. The prospect was illimitable. "Do people always grow much on their birthdays?" asked one of the little ones. I had boasted in the nursery that when I was 13 I should be nearly grown up, and I myself had hardly outlived the idea that on one's birthday one was a year older than on the previous day, and might naturally expect to have made a year's growth during the night. This birthday, however, produced no such striking change. As usual, the presents were charming, the wreath as lovely as Fatima's deft fingers could make it, the general holiday and pleasure-making almost too much of a good thing. Otherwise, there was little to mark it from other days in the year. Towards evening, we were all sitting on the grass, the boys with their heads on the sisters' laps, and there had been an outcry for a story, to which no one had responded, partly perhaps because the exquisite air of evening seemed a sufficient delight, the stillness too profound to be lightly disturbed. We had remained for some time without speaking, and the idea was becoming general among the girls that the boys were napping, when the summer silence was broken by the distant footfalls of a horse upon the high road. "Trotting," observed one of the supposed sleepers. We were not, as a family, given to explanations, and we drew a few more breaths of the evening air in silence. Then someone said, "We might make a story out of that and fancy all sorts of things. Who is it? Where does he come from, and where is he going to?" "It is a messenger from the seat of war," drawled the boy in my lap without moving. Then lifting his curly head for a moment, he cried, "To horse! Gentlemen, to horse! The enemy will be at Carter's Mill by midnight." There was a pause. The solitary footfalls came nearer through the evening mists, and a small brother, of a quaint turn of mind, much given to the study of the historical portions of the Old Testament, sat up and said slowly, "It is one of Job's messengers. The Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee." The others' boys laughed, but he lay down again as solemnly as he had risen. "That was a foot messenger," said my boy contemptuously. "It doesn't say so," retorted the small brother. "Well, anyway, the camels had been carried off, so what did he ride upon?" A squabble was imminent. I covered my boy's face with a handkerchief to keep him quiet. "Listen," I said, "it's the post. The mail from the north was stopped on the highway, but he has saved the bags and is riding hard for London. It's—" But the new suggestion was drowned in a general shout of, "It's coming up the lane!" The footfalls had diverged from the main road and were coming up the sandy lane that skirted our wall. The boys lifted their heads, and we sat expectant. There was a pause and a familiar gate click, and then the footfalls broke upon the carriage road close by us. A man in livery, upon a well-groomed horse, nothing more but rather an uncommon sight with us. Moreover, the man and his livery were strange, and the horse looked tired. This event broke up the sitting, and we were strolling up to the house when a maid met us, saying that my mother wished to see me and Fatima. We found my mother sewing, with an opened letter beside her. It was written on one of the large quarto sheets then in use, and it was covered and crossed at every available corner, in a vague, scratchy hand. "I have heard from an old friend of mine, Mary," said my mother. "She has come to live about 12 miles from here. There is something in the letter about you and Fatima, and you may read that part aloud if you can, the top of the last page." I found the place, and with some difficulty deciphered. The dear Major was all delicacy and consideration. "No, no," said my mother. The next sentence. "Dear Cecilia was all sweetness. The dress was—" My mother took the letter and found the right place herself, and then I read, "If you cannot come yourself, at least let us renew acquaintance in our children. I think you have 2 girls about 13. My Lucy, a dear child just 15, feels keenly the loss of her only sister, and some young companions would be a boon, as all our company will be elders. Pray send them. They can come by the coach, and shall be met at Durnford at the Elephant and Castle." "Is the other sister dead?" asked Fatima pityingly, when we had discussed our personal interest in the subject. "Oh no, only married," said my mother. It was decided that we should go. This decision was not arrived at once, or without some ups and downs. My mother could not go herself, and had some doubts as to our being old enough as yet to go out visiting alone. It will be believed that I made much of being able to say, "But you know, I am 13 now." Next day in the evening my father was busy in his study, and my mother sat at the open window, with Fatima and me at her feet. The letter of acceptance had been duly sent by the messenger, but she had yet a good deal of advice to give, and some doubts to express. She was one of those people who cannot sit with idle fingers, and as she talked, she knitted. We found it easy enough to sit idle upon 2 little footstools, listening to the dear kind voice, and watching 2 little clouds, fragments of a larger group, which had detached themselves and were sailing slowly and alone across the heavens. "They are like us two," Fatima had whispered to me. "Perhaps they are going to see some other clouds." I have observed 2 things which are apt to befall young people who go out visiting, said my mother as she turned a row in her knitting. "One is that they neglect little good habits while they are away, and the other is that they make themselves very disagreeable when they come back." The clouds drifted on, and my mother continued her knitting, arming us with many wise counsels on small matters connected with this great event, to which Fatima and I gratefully gave half our minds, whilst with the other half we made rosy pictures of unparalleled excellence under trying circumstances, by which hereafter we should prove these warnings and counsels to have been, in our case, unnecessary and superfluous. "Most families and most people," said my mother, "have little good habits and customs of their own which they feel bound to keep, although they are not among the great general duties which bind everyone. So long as young people are at home, these matters are often simple enough, but when they go away, certain difficulties arise. They go amongst people whose little habits are not the same as those to which they have been accustomed. Sometimes they come to very uncharitable conclusions upon their friends' characters in consequence. And I must say that I have never met with anyone who could be more severe than young people of your age are apt to be. I remember it of myself, and I have seen it in so many other girls. Home is naturally the standard, and whatever is different seems wrong. As life goes on, these young critics learn, or should learn, to distinguish between general and particular duties, and also coming to know a larger number of people, they find that all good persons are not cut to the same pattern, and that one's friends' little ways are not therefore absurd, because one does not happen to be used to them. On the other hand, if going amongst other people may tempt you to be critical of their little habits, it is also apt to make you neglect your own. Perhaps you think this cannot much matter, as they are not the great duties, and as other people seem to get on quite well without them. But one learns in the end that no character of any value is formed without the discipline of individual rules, and that rules are of no use that are not held to against circumstances. Charitable to others, severe to himself, seems a maxim for grown-up people and grown-up things. But I believe, my little daughters, that the doubts and difficulties of life begin very early, earlier than they are commonly provided against. I think that innumerable girls struggle miserably in the practice of duty, from a radical ignorance of its principles, and that the earlier these are learnt, the smaller is the burden of regret one heaps together to oppress the future, and the sooner one finds that peace of mind which is not common even amongst the young, and should be light-hearted. In these, or words to this effect, my dear mother prepared us for our first plunge into society. We discussed the little good habits we were to maintain, and, amongst others, certain little Sunday customs, for we were to be away for a week. "We can't take all our good habits with us if you won't come," I said. "What is to become of the Sunday readings?" For my mother used to read to us every Sunday evening, and we were just in the middle of that book of wondrous fascination, The Pilgrim's Progress. "If it were not for the others, and if you would trust us with it," said Fatima thoughtfully, "we might take the book with us, and Mary might read to me if she would. I like her reading." My mother consented. There was another copy in the house, and though this volume was a favorite, she said it was time we learnt to take care of valuable books. So it was settled. We talked no more that evening, and the clouds drifted out of sight. "They have gone to bed in a big dark cloud on the other side," said Fatima, yawning, and we went to bed also. My story wanders, Ida. This is because it is an old woman's tale. Old people of my age become prosy, my dear. They love to linger over little remembrances of youth, and to recall the good counsels of kind voices long silent. But I must not put you to sleep a second time, so I will not describe the lists of good habits which Fatima and I drew up in fine Roman characters, and which were to be kept as good resolutions had never been kept before. We borrowed the red ink to make them the more impressive to the eye, and unfortunately spilt it. A bad beginning, as many of our rules had reference to tidiness. Neither will I give you the full account of how we packed, how our preparations began at once, and were only stopped by the necessity of setting off when the day arrived, how we emptied all our drawers and cupboards, and disarranged both our bookshelves, and in making ready for the life of order and tidiness we were to live abroad, passed that week at home with our room in such chaos as it had never been before. How we prepared against an amount of spare time. That experience eventually teaches one is not to be found out visiting, and, with this object, took more sewing than we should have performed in a month at home. Books that we had not touched for years, drawings that were fated to be once touched and no more. I will not describe the big box which my father lent to us, nor the joys of packing it. How Fatima's workbox dovetailed with my desk. How the books, not having been chosen with reference to this great event, were of awkward sizes, and did not make comfortable paving for the bottom of the trunk. Whilst folded stockings may be called the packer's delight, from their usefulness to fill up corners. How, having packed the whole week long, we were barely ready, and a good deal flurried at the last moment, and how we took all our available property with us, and left the key of the trunk behind. Fancy for yourself how the green coach picked us up at the toll bar, and how, as it jingled on, we felt the first qualm of homesickness, and stretching our heads and hands out of the window, waved adieu and kisses innumerable to home, regardless of our fellow traveler in the corner, an old gentleman with a yellow silk handkerchief on his head, who proved in the end a very pleasant companion. I remember that we told him our family history, with minutest particulars, and conjugated 4 regular Latin verbs by his orders, and that he rewarded our confidences and learning with the most clear, the most sweet, the most amber-colored sticks of barley sugar I have ever had the good fortune to meet with. I remember also how, in the warmth of our new friendship, Fatima unveiled to him the future, which, through some joke of my father's, we had laid out for ourselves. I am to marry a sultan, for I am moon-faced, but Mary is to be a linguist, for she has large eyes. Then Miss Mary is not to marry, said the old gentleman with a grim smile. I shook my head in sage disdain. When I am 16, I shall be an Amazon. Precisely what I meant by this I don't think I knew myself, but my dreams were an odd compound of heroic and fairy lore, with a love and ambition for learning that were simply an inheritance. Many a night did I fancy myself master of all the languages of the world, hunting up and down the windy hills in a dress of Lincoln green. I had a mighty contempt for men, and a high respect for myself. That was the greatest of my many follies. After these interesting revelations, we had barley sugar all round, and the coach rattled into Durnford. Shall I tell you how we were met at the Elephant and Castle by a footman of most gentlemanlike appearance, his livery excepted, who, with a sagacity which somewhat puzzled us, discovered that we were the young ladies that were expected, and led us to the carriage, firmly opposing my efforts to fulfill the last home orders I had received to look after the box. How in the carriage we found a lady handsomely dressed in black, who came out to meet us, and seemed so anxious for our comfort and so much interested in our arrival, that we naturally supposed her to be the lady who had invited us, till we discovered that she was a lady's maid, and on arriving found our hostess quite another sort of person, with no appearance at all of being particularly interested in our arrival, which I have since found to be the case with the heads of some other country houses. It was a large house, reminding me of the manor within, but prettier outside. Old and irregularly built, with mullioned windows and odd wings and corners. A glowing, well-kept garden contrasted prettily with the gray stone, and the grounds seemed magnificent to our eyes. We were shown into the drawing room where the real lady of the house sat at a dainty writing table, scratching away at a letter that was no doubt as affectionate as the one which my mother had received. She was short-sighted, which seemed to be the case also with most of the other ladies in the room. This, perhaps, was why they stared so hard at us, and then went on with the elaborate pieces of needlework on which all of them were engaged. It seemed to take our hostess a second or two to see us, and another second or two to recall who we were. Then she came forward very kindly, showed us where to sit, and asked after my mother. Whilst I was replying, she crossed to the fireplace and rang the bell, and I felt slightly surprised by her seeming to wish for no further news of her old friend. She asked if we had had a pleasant journey, and Fatima had hardly pronounced a modest yes before she begged we would allow her to finish her letter, and went back to the spindle-legged table. Whilst she scratched, we looked around us. 3 or 4 ladies were in the room, more or less young, more or less pretty, more or less elegantly dressed, and all with more or less elaborate pieces of needlework. There was one gentleman, young and dark, with large brown eyes, who seemed to be employed in making paper pellets of an old letter, chatting the while in a low voice to a young lady with a good deal of red hair. We afterwards found out that he was an Irishman, familiarly called Pat by some of the young ladies, who seemed to be related to him. We had seen all this when the manservant appeared at the door. "Where is Miss Lucy Thompson?" our hostess asked sharply. "I will inquire, ma'am," Thompson replied with the utmost softness, and vanished. The scratching began again. The Irishman went on gently chatting, and it all felt very like a horrid dream. Then Thompson reappeared. "Miss Lucy is out, ma'am." Did she know what time these young ladies were to arrive? Miss Lucy knew that the carriage had gone to meet them, ma'am. Very thoughtless indeed," said the lady. Thompson paused respectfully, as if to receive the full weight of the remark, and then vanished noiselessly as before. There was an awkward pause. Our hostess left off scratching and looked very cross. The Irishman fired one of his pellets across the room and left off chatting, and the red-haired young lady got up and rustled across to us. I remember her so well, Ida, for we fell deeply in love with her and her kindness. I remember her green and white dress. She had a fair round face, more pleasant than really pretty, a white star-like forehead, almost too firm a mouth, but a very gentle voice, at least, so we thought when she said, "As Lucy is out, may I take these young ladies to their room?" Our hostess hesitated and murmured something about Bedford, who was the lady's maid. The star-like forehead contracted, and the red-haired young lady said, rather emphatically. As Lucy is not in to receive her friends, I thought I might perhaps supply her place. Well, my dear Kate, if you will be so kind, said our hostess, I must finish these letters. The yellow room? Said the young lady abruptly, and swept us off without further parley. The Irish gentleman opened the door for us, staring with a half-puzzled, half-amused look at the lofty air with which the young lady passed out. He followed us into the hall, where we left him discharging his remaining pellets at the furniture and whistling Kathleen Mavourneen as clearly as a bird. The yellow room was a large, airy one, with white-painted wainscoting, a huge four-post bed with yellow curtains, and a pretty view from the windows. In the middle of the floor we saw our box standing in all its dignity, uncorded and ready. Then it was the terrible fact broke upon our minds that the key was left behind. My sufferings during the few seconds before I found courage to confide this misfortune to our new friend were considerable. When I did tell her, the calmness and good nature with which she received the confession were both surprising and delightful. The lock doesn't look a very uncommon one, she said as she opened the door. I dare say I may find a key to fit it. What's the matter? Said a voice outside. It was the Irish gentleman. She explained. Keys? Said the Irish gentleman. Got lots in my pocket, besides their being totally unnecessary, as I'm a capital hand at lock-picking. Let me see. With which he slipped in, seeming quite as much at his ease as in the drawing-room, and in another second had squatted upon the floor before our box, where he seemed to be quite as comfortable as in the armchair he had left. Here he poked and fitted and whistled and chatted without a pause. I've locks and keys to everything I possess, he cheerfully remarked, and as I never lock up anything, there's no damage done if the keys are left behind, which is a good thing, you see, as I always leave everything everywhere. Do you make a principle of it? Asked the young lady coldly. I'm afraid I make a practice of it. He had opened the box and was leaning against the bedpost with a roguish twinkle in his brown eyes, which faded, however, under the silent severity of the red-haired young lady, and gave place to a look of melancholy that might have melted granite as he added, I'm all alone, you see, that's what does it. I believe I'm the neatest creature breathing, if I'd only somebody to keep me up to it. Neither his hardened untidiness nor his lonely lot seemed, however, to weigh heavily on his mind, for he withdrew whistling, and his notes were heard about the passages for some little time. When they had died away in a distant part of the house, the red-haired young lady left us also. I shall not give you a lengthened account of our unpacking, dear Ida, though it was as enjoyable but less protracted than the packing up had been. How we reveled in the spacious drawers and cupboards, over which we were queens, and how strictly we followed one of our mother's wise counsels. Unpack to the bottom of your box at once, however short your visit may be. It saves time in the end. We did unpack to the lowest book, an artificial system of memory which I had long been purposing to study, which I thought to find spare moments to get up here, and which, I may as well confess, I did not look at during the visit, and have not learnt to this day. We divided shelves and pegs with all fairness, and as a final triumph found a use for the elaborate watch pockets that hung above our pillows. They were rich with an unlimited expenditure of quilled ribbon, and must have given a great deal of trouble to someone who had not very many serious occupations in this life. Fatima and I wished that we had watches to put in them, till the happy thought suddenly struck one of us that we could keep in them our respective papers of good habits. Bedford came in whilst we were in the midst of our labors, and warmly begged us to leave everything to her, as she would put our things away for us. The red-haired young lady had sent her, and she became a mainstay of practical comfort to us during our visit. She seemed a haven of humanity after the conventions of the drawing-room. From her we got incidental meals when we were hungry, spirits of wine when Fatima's tooth ached, warnings when we were near to being late for breakfast, little modern and fashionable turns to our hair and clothes, and familiar anecdotes of this household and of others in which she had lived. I remember her with gratitude. Miss Lucy came home before our putting away was fairly finished, and we had tea with her in the schoolroom. She was a slight, sharp, lively young lady, looking older than 15 to us, rather pretty and very self-possessed. She scanned us from head to foot when we first met, and I felt as if her eyes had found defects innumerable, which seemed the less likely as she also was short-sighted. As her governess was away visiting a sick relative, Miss Lucy did the honors of the schoolroom. She was cold and inattentive at first, became patronizing at tea, and ended by being gracious. In her gracious mood she was both affectionate and confidential. She called us "my dear girls," put her arms round us as we sat in the dark, and chattered without a pause about herself, her governesses, her sister, and her sister's husband. "A wedding in the house," she observed, "is very good fun, particularly if you take a principal part in it. I was chief bridesmaid, you know, my dear girls. But I'll tell you the whole affair from the first. You know I had never been bridesmaid before, and I couldn't make up my mind about how I should like the dresses, etc., etc. And we had got no further in the story than Miss Lucy's own costume, when we were called to dress and go downstairs. "What are you going to put on?" she asked, balancing herself at our door and peering in. "White muslin," we said with some pride, for they were new frocks and splendid in our eyes. "I have had so many muslins. I am tired of them," she said. "I shall wear a pink silk tonight. The trimming came from London. Perhaps I may wear a muslin tomorrow. I have an Indian one. But you shall see my dresses tomorrow, my dear girls." With which she left us, and we put on our new frocks, which were to be the evening dresses of our visit, in depressed spirits. This was owing to the thought of the pink silk and of the possibility of a surfeit of white muslin. During the evening we learnt another of Miss Lucy's peculiarities. Affectionate as she had been when we were alone together, she was no sooner among the grown-up young ladies downstairs than she kept with them as much as she was permitted, and seemed to forget us altogether. Perhaps a fit of particularly short sight attacked her, for she seemed to look over us, away from us, on each side of us, anywhere but at us, and to be quite unconscious of our existence. The red-haired young lady had made her fetch us a large scrapbook, and we sat with this before our eyes and the soft, monotonous chit-chat of our hostess in our ears as she talked and worked with some elder ladies on the sofa. It seemed a long gossip with no particular end or beginning, in which tatting, trimmings, military distinction, linens, servants, honorable conduct, sentiment, settlements, expectations, and bath waters were finely blended. From the constant mention of Cecilia and the dear Major, it was evident that the late wedding was the subject of discourse. Indeed, for that matter, it remained the prime topic of conversation during our stay. Cecilia and the dear Major were at Bath, and their letters were read aloud at the breakfast table. I remember wondering at the deep interest that all the ladies seemed to take in the bride's pretty flow of words about the fashions, the drives, and the pump room, and the long lists of visitors' names. This, too, without any connection between the hearers and the people and places mentioned. When anybody did recognize a name, however, about which she knew anything, it seemed like the finding of a treasure. All the ladies bore down upon it at once, dug up the family history to its farthest known point, and divided the subject among them. Miss Lucy followed these letters closely, and remembered them wonderfully, though, as I afterwards found, she had never seen Bath, and knew no more of the people mentioned than the little hearsay facts she had gathered from former letters. It is a very useful art, my dear Ida, and one in which I have sadly failed all my life, to be able to remember who is related to whom, what watering place such a family went to the summer before last, and which common friends they met there, etc. But, like other arts, it demands close attention, forbids daydreaming, and takes up a good deal of time. "Wasn't it odd," said Miss Lucy one morning after breakfast, "that Cecilia and the Major should meet those Hicksons?" "Who are the Hicksons?" I asked. "Oh, my dear girl, don't you remember in Cecilia's last letter her telling us about the lady she met in that shop when they were in town, buying a shawl the counterpart of her own? And it seems so odd they should turn up in Bath and be such nice people. Don't you remember Mamma said it must be the same family as that Colonel Hickson who was engaged to a girl with one eye, and she caught the smallpox and got so much marked and he broke it off? Smallpox in one eye would look very ugly," Fatima languidly observed. and this subject drifted after the rest. One afternoon, I remember, it chanced that we were left alone with our hostess in the drawing room. No one else happened to be in the way to talk to, and the good lady talked to us. We were clever girls for our age, I fancy, and we had been used to talk a good deal with our mother. At any rate, we were attentive listeners, and I do not think our hostess required much more of us. I think she was glad of anybody who had not heard the whole affair from beginning to end, and so she put up her feet on the sofa and started afresh with the complete history of her dear Cecilia from the cradle, and had gone on to the Major, his military exploits abroad, his genteel connections at home, and the tendency to gout in the family which troubled him at times, and was a sad anxiety to her dear child when visitors were announced. Our intelligent attention had gained favor for us, and we were introduced to these ladies as daughters of a very dear friend of mine, whom I have not seen for years, on which one lady gave a sweet glance and a tight smile and murmured, "So pleasant to renew acquaintance in the children," and the other ladies gave sweet glances and tight smiles also, and echoed, "So pleasant." "Such sensible girls," said our hostess, as if we were not there, "like women of 50, so like their dear mother, such treasures to my little Lucy. You know she has lost her dear sister," etc., etc. For then the ladies drew together, and our hostess having got a fresh audience, we retired to distant armchairs, a good deal bewildered. But to return to our first evening. Miss Lucy and we retired together, and no sooner had the drawing-room door closed behind us than she wound her arms round our waists, and became as devoted as if we had been side by side the whole evening. "I'll tell you what I'll do, my dear girls," she said when we reached our room. "I'll come and sleep with you. There's lots of room for 3, and then I can go on about Cecilia's affair, and if we don't finish tonight, we can go on tomorrow morning before we get up. I always wake early, so I can call you. I'll come back when I'm ready for bed." And she vanished. We were in bed when she returned. Her hair had been undergoing some wonderful process, and was now stowed away under a large and elaborate nightcap. "Bedford was so slow," said she, "and then, you know, I got into bed and let her tidy the room, and then when she was fairly gone, out I got, and here I am. We shall be as comfortable as possible. I'll be in the middle, and then I can have you on each side of me, my dear girls." And in she sprang. "Did you notice this?" she asked, holding up her hand and pointing out the edging on the sleeve of her night-dress. "It's a new pattern. Do you know it? Oh, my dears, the yards and yards of tatting that Cecilia had for her trousseau. Fatima and I were not rich in tatting edges, and rejoiced when the conversation took another turn. About the proposal," she rambled on. "Do you know I don't really know whereabouts Henry, that is the Major, my brother-in-law, she added, with one of the little attacks of dignity to which she was subject. Proposed, or what he said? I asked Cece, but she wouldn't tell me. She was very cross often. I'm very glad she's married. I think sisters ought to marry off as fast as they can. They never get on well in a house together, you know. I fairly gasped at this idea, and Fatima said bluntly, "There are lots of us, and we get on." "Ah," said Miss Lucy in tones of wisdom, "wait till you're a little older and you'll see." Cece was at school with two sisters who hated each other like poison, and they were obliged to dress alike, and the younger wore out her things much faster than the other one, but she was obliged to wear them till her sisters were done. She used to wish so her sister would marry, Cece said, and the best fun is, now they're both in love with the same man. He's the curate of the church they go to. Which of them is he in love with? I asked. Oh, neither that I know of, said Miss Lucy composedly. They don't know him, you know, but they sit close under the pulpit, and they have such struggles about which shall get into the corner of the pew that's nearest. Cece and I weren't like that, but still I'm very glad she's married. Now wasn't it stupid of her not to tell me? I should never have told anybody, you know. And don't you wonder what gentlemen do say and how they say it? He couldn't propose sitting, and I think standing would be very awkward. I suppose he knelt. Aunt Maria doesn't approve of gentlemen kneeling. She says it's idolatry. I think they must look very silly. Cece wouldn't even tell me what he said. She said he spoke to Mama, and Mama said his conduct was highly honorable. But I think it was very stupid. Do you know, my dears, I have a cousin who was really married at Gretna Green. She married an officer. He was splendidly handsome, but people said things against him, and her parents objected. So they eloped, and then went to Wales, to such a lovely place. Wasn't it romantic? They quarreled afterwards, though. He lives abroad now. People ought to be careful. I shall be very careful myself. I mean to refuse the first few offers I get. And so Miss Lucy rambled on, perfectly unconscious of the melancholy and yet ludicrous way in which she degraded serious subjects, which she was not old enough to understand, or wise enough to reverence. We were too young then to see it fully, but her frivolity jarred upon us, though she amused us and excited our curiosity. She was not worse than many other girls, with plenty of inquisitiveness and sharp sense, and not too much refinement and feeling, whose accomplishments are learnt from the first masters, and whose principles are left to be picked up from gossip, servants, and second-rate books, digested by ignorant, inquisitive, and undisciplined minds. I won't try to recall any more of it, dear Ida. I remember it was a continuous stream of unedifying gossip, varied by small boastings about her own family. "We've so many connections," was a favorite phrase of Miss Lucy's, and it seemed to mean a great deal. "Do you like making trees?" she asked. I was getting sleepy and without much thought replied, I love trees beyond anything, and I like growing oak trees in bottles. Miss Lucy's, my dear girl, I mean family trees, genealogical trees, was patronizing to scorn. Ours is in the spring drawer of the big oak cabinet in the drawing room, she added. We are descended from King Stephen. I believe I was the first to fall asleep that night. The last words I remember hearing were, we've so many connections. The next day's post brought news from Bath of more general interest to the household. The plans of Cecilia and the Major were changed. They were coming to her mother's on the following Monday. My dear girls, I am so glad, said Miss Lucy. You'll see them, but you will have to move out of your room, I'm sorry to say. And for the next 12 hours, Miss Lucy was more descriptive of her family glories in general, and of the glories of her sister and brother-in-law in particular, than ever. Sunday was a day of mixed experiences to us, some pleasant and some the reverse. Miss Lucy in her best clothes was almost intolerably patronizing, and a general stiffness seemed to pervade everything, the ladies' silk dresses included. After breakfast we dawdled about till it was time to dress for church, and as most of the ladies took about 5 minutes more than they had allowed for, it seemed likely that we should be late. At the last moment Miss Lucy lost her prayer book, and it was not till another 5 minutes had gone in the search that she remembered having left it in church the Sunday before. This being settled, we all stowed away in the carriages and drove off. It was only a short drive, but when we came in sight of the quaint little church, there was no sound of bells, and it became evident that we were late. In the porch we shook out our dresses. The Irishman divided the burden of prayer books he had been gallantly bearing. Our hostess turned back from the half-open door to say in a loud and encouraging whisper, It's only the confession. And we swept up the little church into a huge square pew. My dear Ida, I must tell you that we had been brought up to have a just horror of being late for service, this being a point on which my father was what is called very particular. Fatima and I therefore felt greatly discomposed by our late and disturbing entrance, though we were in no way to blame. We had also been taught to kneel during the prayers, and it was with a most uncomfortable sensation of doubt and shamefacedness that we saw one lady after another sit down and bend her bonnet over her lap, and hesitated ourselves to follow our own customs in the face of such a majority. But the red-haired young lady seemed fated to help us out of our difficulties. She sank at once on her knees in a corner of the pew, her green silk falling round her. We knelt by her side, and the question was settled. The little Irishman cast a doubtful glance at her for a moment, and then sat down, bending his head deeply into his hat. We went through a similar process about responding, which did not seem to be the fashion with our hostess and her friends. The red-haired young lady held to her own customs, however, and we held with her. Our responses were the less conspicuous. as they were a good deal drowned by the voice of an old gentleman in the next pew. Diversity seemed to prevail in the manners of the congregation. This gentleman stood during prayers, balancing a huge prayer book on the corner of the pew, and responding in a loud voice, more devout than tuneful, keeping exact time with the parson also, as if he had a grudge against the clerk and felt it due to himself to keep in advance of him. I remember, Ida, that as we came in he was just saying, "Those things which we ought not to have done," and he said it in so terrible a voice, and took such a glance at us over his gold-rimmed spectacles, that I wished the massive pulpit hangings would fall and bury my confusion. When the text of the sermon had been given out, our hostess rustled up and drew the curtains well round our pew. Opposite to me, however, there was a gap through which I could see the old gentleman. He had settled himself facing the pulpit, and sat there gazing at the preacher with a rigid attention which seemed to say, "Sound doctrine, if you please. I have my eye on you." We returned as we came. "Is there afternoon service?" I asked Miss Lucy. "Oh, yes," was the reply. "The servants go in the afternoon." "Don't you?" I asked. "Oh, no," said Miss Lucy. "Once is enough. You can go with the maids if you want to, my dears," she added, with one of the occasional touches of insolence in which she indulged. Afternoon arrived, and I held consultation with Fatima as to what we were to do. When once roused, Fatima was more resolute than I. "Of course we'll go," said she. "What's the use of having written out all our good rules and sticking at this? We always go twice at home. Let's look for Bedford." On which mission I set forth. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I caught sight of the red-haired young lady, in her bonnet and shawl, standing at the open door, a prayer book in her hand. I dashed downstairs and entered the hall just as the Irishman came into it by another door. In his hand was a prayer book also, and he picked up his hat and went smiling towards her. But as he approached the young lady, she looked so much annoyed, not to say cross, that I hesitated to go forwards. "Are you going to church?" said the little Irishman with a pleased look. "I don't know," said the young lady briefly. "Are you?" "I was—" he began, and stopped short, looking puzzled and vexed. "Is no else going?" he asked after a moment's pause. "No one else ever does go," she said impatiently, and moved into the hall. The Irishman colored. "I am in the habit of going twice myself, though you may not think it," he said quietly. "My poor mother always did. But I do not pretend to go to such good purpose as she did, or as you would. So if it is to lie between us—" And, without finishing his sentence, he threw his book, not too gently, onto the table, and just lifting his hat as he passed her, dashed out into the garden. I did not at all understand this little scene, but as soon as he was gone, I ran up to ask our friend if she were going to church, and would take us. She consented, and I went back in triumph to Fatima. As there was no time to lose, we dressed quickly enough, so that I was rather surprised when we went down to find the Irish gentleman, with his face restored to its usual good humor, standing by our friend and holding her prayer book as well as his own. The young lady did not speak, but, cheerfully remarking that we had plenty of time before us, he took our books also, and we all set forth. I remember that walk so well, Ida. The hot, sweet summer afternoon, the dusty plants by the pathway, the clematis in the hedges. I put a bit into my prayer book, which was there for years. The grasshoppers and flies that our dresses caught up from the long grass, and which reappeared as we sat during the sermon. The old gentleman was in his pew, but his glance was almost benevolent, as in good time we took our places. We literally followed his example with much heartiness in the responses, and if he looked over into our pew during prayers, and from his position he could hardly avoid it, he must have seen that even the Irishman had rejected compromises, and that we all knelt together. There was one other feature of that service not to be forgotten. When the sermon was ended and I had lost sight of the last grasshopper in my hasty rising, we found that there was to be a hymn. It was the old custom of this church so to conclude evening prayer. No one seemed to use a book. It was Bishop Ken's evening hymn, which everyone knew, and I think everyone sang. But the feature of it to us was when the Irishman began to sing. From her startled glance, I think not even the red-haired young lady had known that he possessed so beautiful a voice. It had a clearness without effort, a tone, a truth, a pathos, such as I have not often heard. It sounded strangely above the nasal tones of the school children and the scraping of a solitary fiddle. Even our neighbor, who had lustily followed the rhythm of the tune, though without much varying from the note on which he responded, softened his own sounds and turned to look at the Irishman, who sang on without noticing it, till in the last verse he seemed disturbed to discover how many eyes were on him. Happily, self-consciousness had come too late. The hymn was ended. We knelt again for the benediction and then went back through the summer fields. The red-haired young lady talked very little. Once she said, "How is it we have never heard you sing?" To which the Irishman replied, "I don't understand music. I sing by ear, and I hate company performances. I will sing to you whenever you like." "Mary," said Fatima, when we were in our room again, "I believe those two will marry each other some day." "So do I," I answered, "but don't say anything about it to Lucy." "No, indeed," said Fatima warmly. So we kept this idea sacred from Miss Lucy's comments. Why, I do not think either of us could have told in words. Pity that pleasant impressions, pity that most impressions pass away so soon. The evening was not altogether so satisfactory as the afternoon had been. First, Miss Lucy took us to see her sister's wedding presents, most of which were still here in her mother's keeping. They were splendid, and Miss Lucy was eloquent. From them we dawdled on into her room, where she displayed her own treasures, with a running commentary on matters of taste and fashion, which lasted till it was time to dress for the evening, when she made the usual inquiry, "What shall you put on tonight, my dear girls?" And we blushed to own that there was nothing further of our limited toilettes to reveal. In the drawing-room, similar subjects of conversation awaited us. Our hostess and her friends did not seem to care much for reading, and as they did not work on Sunday evening, they talked the more. The chatter ran chiefly upon the Bath fashions, and upon some ball which had been held somewhere, where somebody had been dressed after a manner that it appeared needful to protest against, whilst somebody else, a cousin of our hostess, was at all points so perfectly attired that it seemed as if she should have afforded ample consolation for the other lady's defects. Upon the beauty of this cousin, her father's wealth, and her superabundant opportunities of matrimony, Miss Lucy enlarged to us as we sat in a corner. Another of her peculiarities, by the by, was this. By her own account, all her relatives and friends were, in some sense, beautiful. The men were generally splendidly handsome, the ladies the loveliest creatures. If not lovely, they were stylish. If nothing else, they were charming. For those who were beyond the magic circle, this process was reversed. If pretty, they wanted style. If the dress was beyond criticism, the nose, the complexion, the hand was at fault. I have met with this trait in other cliques since then. My dear Ida, I wish to encourage no young lady of the hoydenish age of 13 in despising nice dressing and pretty looks and manners, or in neglecting to pick up any little hints which she may glean in such things from older friends. But there are people to whom these questions seem of such first importance that to be with them when you are young and impressionable is to feel every defect in your own personal appearance to be a crime, and to believe that there is neither worth, nor love, nor happiness, no life, in fact, worth living for, connected with much less than 10,000 a year, and connections. Through some such ordeal we passed that evening, in seeing and hearing of all the expensive luxuries, without which it seemed impossible to feed, dress, sleep, go out, in fact exist, and all the equally expensive items of adornment, without which it appeared to be impossible to have, or at any rate retain, the respect and affection of your friends. Meanwhile the evening slipped by, and our Sunday reading had not been accomplished. We had found little good habits less easy to maintain in a strange household than we had thought, and this one seemed likely to follow some others that had been allowed to slip. The red-haired young lady had been absent for about half an hour, and the Irishman had been prowling restlessly round the room, performing murderous-looking fidgets with the paper knives, when she returned with a book in her hand, which she settled herself resolutely to read. The Irishman gave a comical glance at the serious-looking volume, and then, seating himself on a chair just behind her, found apparent peace in the effort to sharpen a flat ruler on his knees. The young lady read on. It was evident that her Sunday customs were not apt to be disturbed by circumstances. I began to feel uncomfortable. Fatima was crouched down near Lucy, listening to the history of a piece of lace. I waited some little time to catch her eye, and then beckoned her to me. "We haven't read," I whispered. "Dare you go?" asked Fatima. "We ought," I said. It required more daring than may appear. To such little people as ourselves, it was rather an undertaking to cross the big drawing-room, stealing together over the soft carpet, to attack the large, smooth handle, open the heavy door, and leave the room in the face of the company. We did it, however, our confusion being much increased by the Irish gentleman who jumped up to open the door for us. We were utterly unable to thank him, and, stumbling over each other in the passage, flew up to our own room like caged birds set free. Fatima drew out the pillows from the bed and made herself easy on the floor. I found the book and climbed into the window seat. The sun was setting. The light would not last much longer. Yet I turned over the pages slowly to find the place which was in the second part, thinking of the conversation downstairs. Fatima heaved a deep sigh among her cushions and said, "I wish we were rich." "I wish we were at home," I answered. "When one's at home," Fatima continued in doleful tones, "one doesn't feel it because one sees nobody. But when one goes among other people, it is wretched not to have plenty of money and things. And it's no good saying it isn't," she added hurriedly, as if to close the subject. "It's getting dark," I said. "I beg your pardon, go on," sighed Fatima. I lifted up my voice and read till I could see no longer. It was about the valley of humiliation through which Mr. Greatheart led Christiana and her children. The green valley beautified with lilies, in whose meadows the air was pleasant, where a man shall be free from the noise and from the hurryings of this life, and where in former times men have met with angels. The last streaks of crimson were fading in the sky when I read the concluding lines of the shepherd boy's song. Fullness to such a burden is, that go on pilgrimage, here little and hereafter bliss is best from age to age. Here little and hereafter bliss. It is not always easy to realize what one believes. One needs sometimes to get away from the world around, from the noise and from the hurryings of this life, and to hear, read, see, or do something to remind one that there is a standard which is not of drawing rooms, that petty troubles are the pilgrimage of the soul, that great and happy lives have been lived here by those who have had but little, and that satisfying bliss is not here, but hereafter. We went downstairs slowly, hand in hand. "I wonder what Mother is doing," said Fatima. The next day, Miss Lucy very good-naturedly helped us to move our belongings into the smaller room we were now to occupy. It was in another part of the house, and we rather enjoyed the running to and fro, especially as Miss Lucy was gracious and communicative in the extreme. "This is the oldest part of the house," she said as we sat on the bed resting from our labors, for the day was sultry, "and it breaks off here in an odd way. There are no rooms beyond this. There were some that matched the other side of the house, but they were pulled down." "Why?" we asked. "Well, there's a story about it in the family," said Miss Lucy mysteriously. "But it's a ghost story. I'll tell you if you like. But some people are afraid of ghost stories. I'm not, but if you are, I won't tell it." Of course we declared we were not afraid. Sitting there together on a sunny summer's afternoon, perhaps we were not. "It's years and years ago," began Miss Lucy. "You know the place has belonged to another branch of our family for generations. Well, at last it came down to an old Mr. Bartlett, who had one daughter, who, of course, was to be the heiress. Well, she fell in love with a man whose name I forget, but he was of inferior family and very queer character, and her father would not hear of it, and swore that if she married him, he would disinherit her. She would have married the man in spite of this, though, but what he wanted was her money. So, when he found that the old man was quite resolute, and that there was no chance of his dying soon, he murdered him." We both exclaimed, for this sudden catastrophe fairly took away our breath. Miss Lucy's nerves were not sensitive, however, and she rattled on. "He smothered him in bed, and as he was a very old man, and might easily have died in the night some other way, and as nothing could be proved, he got off. Well, he married the daughter and got the property, but the very first evening after he took possession, as he was passing the door of the old man's room, he heard somebody breathing heavily inside, and when he looked in, there was the old father asleep in his bed." "Not really?" we said. "Of course not really," said Miss Lucy, "but so it was said. That's the ghost part of it. Well, do what he would, he never could get rid of the old man, who was always there asleep. So he pulled the rooms down, and at last he went abroad. And there both he and his wife died, and the property went to a cousin who took the name of Bartlett." "How awful," we murmured. But Miss Lucy laughed and told us other family anecdotes, and the ghost story somewhat passed from our minds, especially as a little later we heard wheels, and peeping from the landing window beheld a post-chaise drive up. "It's Cecilia!" screamed Miss Lucy, and left us at once. I may as well say here, my dear Ida, that Cecilia and the Major proved altogether different from our expectations. Cecilia, in traveling gear, taking off an old bonnet, begging for a cup of tea, and complaining in soft accents that butter was a halfpenny a pound dearer in Bath than at home, seemed to have no connection with that Cecilia into the trimmings of whose dresses banknotes had recklessly dissolved. The Major, an almost middle-aged man of roughish exterior in plain clothes, pulling his mustache over a letter that had arrived for him, dispelled our visions of manly beauty and military pomp even more effectually. Later on, we discovered that Cecilia was really pretty, soft, and gentle, a good deal lectured by her mother, and herself more critical of Miss Lucy's dress and appearance than that young lady had been of ours. The Major proved kind and sensible. He was well-to-do and had expectations, which facts shed round him a glory invisible to us. They seemed a happy couple, more like the rest of the world than we had been led to suppose. The newcomers completely absorbed our attention during the evening, and it was not till we were fairly entering the older part on the house on our way to bed that the story of the old man's ghost recurred to my mind. It was a relief to meet Bedford at this point, to hear her cheerful good night, and to see her turn into a room only 2 doors from ours. Once, while we were undressing, I said, "What a horrid story that was that Lucy told us," to which sensible Fatima made answer, "Don't talk about it." We dismissed the subject by consent, got into bed, and I fell asleep. I do not quite know how far on it was into the night when I was roused by Fatima's voice repeating my name over and over again in tones of subdued terror. I know nothing more irritatingly alarming when one is young and nervous than to be roused thus by a voice in which the terror is evident and the cause unknown. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Don't you hear?" gasped Fatima in a whisper. If she had said at once that there was a robber under the bed, a burglar at the window, or a ghost in the wardrobe, I should have prepared for the worst, and it would have been less alarming than this unknown evil. "I hear nothing," I said pettishly. "I wish you'd go to sleep, Fatima." "There, now," said Fatima. I held my breath, and in the silence heard distinctly the sound of someone snoring in an adjoining apartment. "It's only someone snoring," I said. "Where?" asked Fatima, with all the tragedy in her voice unabated. "In the room behind us, of course," I said impatiently. "Can't you hear?" Fatima's voice might have been the voice of a shadow as she answered, "There is no room there." And then a cold chill crept over me also, for I remembered that the wall from behind which the snoring unmistakably proceeded was an outer wall. There had been the room of old Mr. Bartlett, which his son-in-law and murderer had pulled down. There he had been heard breathing heavily, and had been seen asleep upon his bed, long after he was smothered in his own pillows, and his body shut up in the family vault. At least, so it was said, and at that particular moment we felt no comfort from the fact that Miss Lucy had said that of course it wasn't true. I said something, to which Fatima made no reply, and I could feel her trembling and hear a half-choked sob. I think fear for her overpowered my other alarm and gave me a sort of strength. "Don't, dear," I begged. "Let's be brave. It must be something else. And there's nothing in the room. Let's go to Bedford. She's next door but one." Fatima could speak no more. By the moonlight through the blind, I jumped up, and half dragged, half helped her out of bed and across the room. Opening the door was the worst. To touch anything at such a moment is a trial. We groped down the passage. I felt the handle of the first door and turned that of the second, and in we went. The window blind of this room was drawn up, and the moonlight streamed over everything. A nest of white drapery covered one chair. A muslin dress lay like a sick ghost over a second. Some little black satin shoes and web-like stockings were on the floor. A gold watch and one or two feminine ornaments lay on the table. And in the bed reposed, not Bedford, but our friend Kate, fast asleep, with one arm over the bedclothes, and her long red hair in a pigtail streaming over the pillow. I climbed up and treated her as Fatima had treated me, calling her in low, frightened tones over and over again. She woke at last and sat up. "You sprites! What is the matter?" she exclaimed. I stumbled through an account of our misfortunes, in the middle of which the young lady lay down, and before it was ended I believe she was asleep again. Poor Fatima, who saw nothing before us but to return to our room with all its terrors, here began to sob violently, which roused our friend once more, and she became full of pity. "You poor children," she said. "I'm so sleepy. I cannot get up and go after the ghost now. Besides, one might meet somebody. But you may get into bed if you like. There's plenty of room and nothing to frighten you." In we both crept, most willingly. She gave us the long tail of her hair and said, "If you want me, pull, but go to sleep if you can." And before she had well finished the sentence, her eyes closed once more. In such good company, a snoring ghost seemed a thing hardly to be realized. We held the long plait between us, and clinging to it as drowning men to a rope, we soon slept also. When we returned to our room next day, there was no snoring to be heard, and in the full sunshine of a summer morning our fright seemed so completely a thing of the past that I persuaded myself to suggest that it might have been fancy. Kate had already expressed her deliberate opinion to this effect, to which Fatima, whose convictions were of a more resolute type than mine, replied, "What's the use of trying to believe what's not true? I heard it, and shall know that I heard it, if I live till I'm 100. In all correct ghost stories, when the hero comes down in the morning, valiant but exhausted from the terrors of the night, to breakfast, his host invariably asks him how he slept. When we came down, we found Kate and the Irishman alone together in the breakfast room. Now it certainly was in keeping with our adventure when he stepped forward and, bowing profoundly, asked how we had passed the night. But in spite of the gravity of his face, there was a twinkle in the big brown eyes which showed us that we were being made fun of. And I felt slightly indignant with our friend, who had faithfully promised not to betray us to Miss Lucy, and might, I thought, have saved us from the ridicule of the Irishman. The rest of the company began to assemble, however, and to our relief the subject was dropped. But though the Irishman kept our secret, we had every reason to suspect that he did not forget it. He looked terribly roguish through breakfast, and was only kept in order by Kate's severe glances. "Always breathe through the nose," he suddenly began. "It moderates the severity of the air, is less trying to the lungs, and prevents snoring." "Very true," said the Major, who was sensible and liked instructive observations. "It may be laid down as an axiom," continued the Irishman gravely, "that the man who snores is sure to disturb somebody, and also that the man who doesn't snore till he dies is not likely to live to be a snoring ghost when he is dead." Kate looked daggers. The Major laughed and said, "Let me give you some beef." When he didn't understand a remark, he always laughed, and generally turned the conversation to eatables, in which he was pretty safe. For food is common ground, and a slight laugh answers most remarks, unless at a serious meeting or a visit of condolence. A little later the Irishman asked, "What's the origin of the expression to stir up with a long pole?" which turned the conversation to wild beasts. But he presently inquired, "What's the meaning of putting a thing up the spout?" "Pawning it," said the Major promptly. "People pawn their family jewels sometimes," said Pat. "Did you ever hear of anybody pawning the family ghosts?" he asked, suddenly turning to me. I gave a distressed "No," and he continued in a whisper, "You never saw a ghost up the spout?" But before I could answer, he caught Kate's eye, and making a penitent face, became silent. We were in the drawing-room after breakfast, when the Irishman passed the window outside, whistling Kathleen Mavourneen. We were sitting at Kate's feet, and she got up, and whispering, "He's got something to show you, but he wouldn't let me tell," went out into the garden, we following her. There we found the Irishman with a long pole, which he was waving triumphantly in the air. He bowed as we approached. "This, young ladies," he said, "is the original long pole spoken of at the breakfast table. With this I am about to stir up and bring forth for your inspection the living and identical ghost whose snoring disturbed your repose last night." The little Irishman's jokes reassured me. I guessed that he had found some clue to our mysterious noise, but with Fatima it was otherwise. She had been too deeply frightened to recover so easily. She clung tremblingly to me as I was following him and whispered, "I'd rather not." On her behalf, I summoned courage to remonstrate. "If you please, sir," I said, "Fatima would rather not, and if you please, don't tease us any more." The young lady added her entreaties, but they were not needed. The good-natured little gentleman no sooner saw Fatima's real distress than he lowered his pole and sank upon his knees on the grass with a face of genuine penitence. "I am so sorry I've been tormenting you so," he exclaimed. "I forgot you were really frightened, and you see I knew it wasn't a ghost." "I heard it," murmured Fatima resolutely, with her eyes half shut. "So did I," said the Irishman gaily. "I've heard it dozens of times. It's the owls." We both exclaimed. "Ah," he said comically, "I see you don't believe me. That's what comes of telling so many small fibs. But it's true, I assure you." And the brown eyes did look particularly truthful. Barn door owls do make a noise that is very like the snoring of an old man. And there are some young ones who live in the spout at the corner of the wall of your room. They're snoring and scrambling in and out of that spout all night. It was quite true, Ida, as we found when Fatima was at last persuaded to visit the corner where the rooms had been pulled down, and where, decorated with ivy, the old spout formed a home for the snoring owls. By the aid of the long pole he brought out a young one to our view, a shy, soft, lovely, shadow-tinted creature, ghostly enough to behold, who felt like an impalpable mass of fluff, utterly refused to be kissed, and went savagely blinking back into his spout at the earliest possible opportunity. His snoring alarmed us no more. "And the noise really was that?" said Ida. "It really was, my dear." "It's a splendid story," said Ida. "You see, I didn't go to sleep this time. And what became of everybody, please? Did the red-haired young lady marry the Irishman?" "Very soon afterwards, my dear," said Mrs. Over-the-Way. "We kept up our friendship, too, in after life, and I have many times amused their children with the story of the snoring ghost." John Cooper was a little boy whose father and mother lived in a cottage on one side of a village green. He was his parents' only child, so that he had no brothers nor sisters to play with. But he had a dog of which he was very fond, and he used sometimes to play with other children on the green. Tom Jones was one of the boys that played with John Cooper. One day he asked John Cooper to go for a long walk with him instead of going to school. John at first would not consent, but at last he gave way and went with Tom, taking Carlo with him. There was a pretty stream of water that ran along one side of the green, and then passed through a wood in a winding course. In some places it was rather broad and deep, and in other places it was shallow, and ran murmuring over the stones at the bottom. Tom said that it would be very pleasant to go along the stream, sometimes on one side, and sometimes on the other, far into the wood, and to look for birds' nests. The sun was shining very brightly, the trees were in full leaf, the grass was thick and green, sweet flowers were blooming on all sides, Butterflies and dragonflies sported in the sunshine, and birds were singing on every bush and tree. All things seemed to be joyful, and the two boys started off briskly, with Carlo after them. But of this party, the only one that was truly happy was Carlo. He had nothing to do but to obey his master, and this he had done when John had called him away from his home. John tried to raise his own spirits, and ran and jumped about and romped with Carlo. But he could not forget that he had done wrong, that he ought to have been at school, and that he should grieve his kind parents when they knew what he was now doing. The thought of this would come into his mind, and kept him from being happy. As for Tom Jones, he seemed merry enough, though he not only knew that he was doing wrong himself, but that he had led John into mischief. He tried to forget this, and laughed and shouted with all his might. But it was in vain, and he had bitter feelings at the bottom of his heart all the time. They went on rambling till they had got more than a mile into the wood. The stream here was wide and deep. On one side of it there grew an old willow, and in one of the branches of this they saw a wren's nest. As Tom was the stronger boy of the two, it was agreed that he should help John up to the branch, so that he might reach the nest. John got upon the branch, and he had put out his hand to take hold of the nest, when the branch broke off, and down he fell into the water. Tom laughed at this, for he knew that the stream was not deep enough to drown him, but Carlo rushed in and dragged his master by the clothes towards the bank. John scrambled out, but he was covered with mud. Tom helped him to take off his clothes and clean off the mud and dry them, but with all they could do, John was still in a sad mess. And as it was now late in the day, he turned to go home with a heavy heart. When he reached the cottage, he found his father and mother in great alarm, as they could not think what had become of him. When they found out what had taken place, their alarm was changed into grief, on account of the son whom they loved so much, having done wrong. John himself cried a great deal, and said that he was more vexed because he had caused them grief than he should have been if they had scolded and whipped him. His mother told him that she left it to his own heart to scold him, and that he should go to his bedroom and pray to God on his knees to forgive him, as she had taught him to pray. John did as she bade him, and he prayed to God with all his heart. He then went to sleep with a quiet mind, and when he awoke the next morning, he prayed again that God would give him strength to do his duty, and to stand firm when he should be tempted again, as he had been by Tom Jones. He then read a chapter in the Bible to his mother, and went to school. His master kept him in, and gave him only a piece of bread and a cup of water for dinner. But he did not suffer nearly so much from this as he had done from having grieved his dear parents. For he had before this been brought to repent, and he felt that God and his father and mother had forgiven him. John Cooper never again grieved his father and mother by doing wrong, and never forgot the lesson he had learned, when Tom Jones led him astray as long as he lived. When John Cooper became a man, there were bad times, and he could not get a living at the trade to which he had been brought up. So he went for a horse soldier, and before he went, his father and mother gave him their blessing, and he prayed with all his heart that God would bless the old people and preserve them, and said he would let them have as much of his pay as ever he could. It was a sad day for him and his parents when he went away. They had never been parted for so long a time before, and he was now going to India, from whence he could not return for some years. But they could not help it. So they all said that it was God's will that they should part, and it was their duty to bear it as well as they could. After John was gone, the old people never missed a day, but they prayed to God to keep their son, both in his soul and body, from all evil. They were very poor, and were now too old to work much. But with what they got of John's pay, they had enough just to live upon, and above all they had thankful hearts, which made them happy. Yet they often wished for John's return. Sometimes, too, they were fearful lest he should be killed or wounded in the wars. But when they felt thus, they always tried to put their trust in God. When John had been away 10 years, he came back one day, safe and sound, as his father and mother were standing at the door of the cottage. You may judge how they all felt, and how many questions his fond mother asked him as to where he had been and how he had got on. The next day was Sunday, and both John and his parents were glad of it, for they wished to go to church to offer up their thanks to God, who had kept John safe through many dangers, had saved the lives of the old people, and had now brought them to each other again. It was a fine, bright morning in spring, just such a one as it had been nearly 20 years before, when Tom Jones had tempted John Cooper to keep away from school and to go into the wood to take birds' nests. John did not forget that day, and when it came into his mind he could not help thinking of the changes that had taken place since. He went to church, and you may be sure that he and the old man and woman gave thanks to God with all their hearts for the mercy he had shown to them. Mary Jones was a poor woman whose husband had gone to sea on a long voyage. She lived in a house by the roadside and got her living by washing. She had 2 little boys who were her great comfort, and whom she used to call Ned and Tom. For some time after her husband had left, she got on very well, and was able to send the boys to school, but she caught a fever and was forced to keep her bed. Her neighbor, Sarah Smith, was very kind to her, and used to come to the house every morning and evening to do what she could to help her. But she was a poor woman, and could not afford to give Mary Jones anything that cost money, so poor Mary was forced to part with a great many things that she might get food. Ned and Tom at this time took turns to go to school. Tom used to go to school one day, while Ned waited on his mother, and the next day Ned went to school and Tom stayed at home. One morning when Ned was going to school, the thought of his poor mother pressed hard on his heart, and after he had gone a little way, he burst out crying. He had not gone far along the narrow lane towards the school when two young ladies met him and asked him why he was crying. He told them that he was thinking of his poor sick mother. The ladies then asked him his name and where he lived, and said they would go and call upon his mother. He thanked them and dried up his tears, and went on to school with a much lighter heart. Soon after he reached home in the evening, the two kind ladies came to his mother's house with a footboy, who brought a basket filled with bread and meat, and some things fit for the poor sick woman. They told Mary Jones how they had met Ned in the lane, and what he had told them, and she thanked them for what they had brought, and said that she hoped God would bless them for their goodness to her. They then asked about Ned and Tom, and said they would get their father to do what he could for them. The young ladies then went home, told their father and mother what they had seen and heard, and thanked God that they had been able to make a poor woman and her two sons happy. There was a poor woman named Rachel Jenkins, who lived in a very little cottage at some distance from any other house. She was a widow and very poor, but she was very clean and careful, so that her cottage had always a look of neatness and comfort. She used to spend most of her time in spinning. She had one son, whose name was Harry. He was 12 years old, and used to carry a basket filled with tapes and thread, pins and needles, and other things of that sort, which he sold to people who lived near. He used to go out in the morning and return in the evening, and you may be sure his mother was always glad when the time came for him to come home. One evening, as he was on his way home, about half a mile from his mother's house, he saw an old man sitting by the wayside, who was very tired and seemed as if he was not able to walk any further. His hair was quite white, and his face and hands were thin and wrinkled. Harry said to him in a kind voice, "You seem tired, Father. Have you got much further to walk?" The old man told him that he had to go to the next town, which was 12 miles further, but that he was so tired he was sure that he should not be able to get there that night. On this, Harry said, "I wish you would go home with me, for I am sure my mother would be very glad that you should sleep in our house." The old man thanked him and said he would go with him. So he rested his hand upon Harry's shoulder and walked slowly towards the house. Harry's mother met them at the door, and when Harry had told her how he had met with the old man, she said she was glad to see him and asked him to walk in to take some tea. After tea, the old man told Sarah Jenkins that he was going to see his son, who was laid up in a hospital in the town to which he was going. His son was a soldier, and had been in the West Indies for some years, but he caught the yellow fever and was sent home sick. The next morning the old man went on his way and blessed Sarah Jenkins and Harry, because they had done good to him who could make no other return than to thank them and pray for them. When I was a girl, Sunday evening used to be the part of the week that I loved best, and I liked it better in winter than in summer. We used to sit round a blazing fire. My mother used then to teach my little brother Tom to say his prayers, and my father used to teach me to read in Pilgrim's Progress or some such book, while my brother John sat near reading some book or other that was fit for a Sunday with his dog Hector lying at his feet. My dear old grandfather was then alive, and he would sit at the table with the large old family Bible before him for the whole evening. As I look back upon the pleasant picture in my mind, my eye fills with tears. I cannot help thinking of what has become of the faces that were then so full of smiles and gladness. My grandfather went to the grave first, but he died in a good old age. And though we mourned to lose him whom we had all loved so much, we could not help feeling that it was a happy change for him, as he could hardly see or hear. Next to him, my poor little brother Tom fell ill of the typhus fever, and God took him to heaven in the budding of his childhood. Only a year or two ago, my father gave me his dying blessing and was then a very old man. My mother now survives, though very old, and my two sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who were then lively girls, are living and are the mothers of families. My brother John, a middle-aged man, is the captain of a ship, being now far away on a voyage, and he has left behind him a wife and two boys, the youngest of whom is as old as he was at the time I have spoken of. I am almost an old woman, though on these happy evenings that I was speaking of, I was the youngest but one. You, my little friends, will perhaps some day have to look back upon such changes as I have seen. The thought that they will come upon you need not make you sad, but it should make you good, and cause you to resolve to do your duty and to serve God. If you do so, when you get as old as I am, you will find that if age brings its cares and sorrows, it also brings surer and even brighter hopes of a life beyond the grave. John Davis and his wife were very poor people, but as they worked very hard, they could just get a living for themselves. John worked for a farmer in the parish, and his wife took in needlework. They did pretty well when John had work, but for nearly 2 years John's master could not employ him always, and he was brought almost to distress. But his wife always used to keep up his spirits by saying, "Be content, and thank God if you can but live. Brighter hours will come." Sometimes John was quite spirit-broken, and said he should leave home and try to get work somewhere else. He was forced to sell some of his goods to buy food, and did not know which way to turn. But his wife never failed to wear a cheerful face, and used to be always saying to him, "Do your best, and be content to take what God appoints." John loved his wife very much, but he was sometimes half vexed because she was never sad like he was. He would tell her that it was a very good thing to be cheerful and happy when they could get a good living. She then used to say to him that there was no virtue in being content when all was going on well, and that the proper time to try to be cheerful was when things were going amiss. At last, better times came. John got into work on the estate of a rich man who lived near, and as he was a very honest man and knew his work, his master soon put him in a place of trust, raised his wages, and gave him a good house to live in. John had by this time got 5 children, and he could no longer deny that he had reason enough to be a happy man. You may see him and his wife and children in the picture, enjoying a fine summer's evening in front of their house. I knew John when I was young, and he was always ready to say how much was due to his good wife. He told me that he owed all his good fortune to her cheerful spirits and good advice to him, and added that now he was well off, he found the truth of what she had told him, that the proper time to try to be cheerful was when things were going amiss. I have never forgot that lesson, and I hope I never shall, and I beg my young friends to keep in mind that contentment is a constant feast. There is work enough in the world for everyone to do something. There is no proper place for idle people. This is what old Michael the basket maker used to say to his children, and as they grew up, they found reason enough to thank him for the lesson. Michael had been a sailor in his youth, but when he married, he settled in a country place and took up the trade of a basket maker. At first, he could hardly get money enough to buy rods, but by working very hard, he soon got money and credit too. No one in the village was now up before Michael, and most people went to bed before he left off work. Small as was the sum of money that he could earn in a week, he would always put by something, if it was but a penny. Every month he put these savings into the savings bank, and in the course of the first 6 years, he found he had got 25 pounds. By this time he had got 2 children, and the eldest was old enough to learn to read. She used to sit by him with her book as he worked, and he taught her when she wanted help. His wife was in the meantime doing something in the house, or working for some of the farmers who lived near. Michael now bought a cow and 2 pigs and made some profit by them. In 6 years more he bought the cottage he lived in, and 12 years after this, that is 24 years after he was married, he rented a little farm. By this time he had 7 children, and as he had made his cottage larger, they all lived at home and helped him. His eldest boys worked at the farm, and the girls milked the cows and made the butter under the care of their mother and kept the poultry. As for Michael himself, though he was well off, he kept on his old trade and went on in his old habits. The last time I saw him before I left the place in which he lived, he was teaching his youngest child to read while he was at work, just as he had taught his eldest. I have often thought of Michael's words, "There is no place in the world for idle people." And now, as we come to the end of this session, if you're still awake, I would like you to feel the calm you've created within yourself. You've given your mind and body such a beautiful gift, a moment to simply be. Let that sense of peace stay with you as you move through the rest of your night. If you'd like, you can stay here a little longer.